The sun rose slowly behind the maple trees that lined the narrow street of Elmridge Lane. Its soft, golden rays filtered through the rustling leaves, painting the pavement with trembling patches of light. Inside a small white cottage tucked at the end of the lane, Margaret shuffled to the kitchen in her slippers, tying her robe as she passed the grandfather clock. It was 7:12 a.m., a little later than usual, but not by much. Harold sat at the kitchen table, humming tunelessly as he stirred honey into his tea. His thick glasses perched halfway down his nose, and a crossword puzzle sat waiting beside his cup. Margaret, as always, placed 2 slices of rye bread into the toaster and reached for the jam jar with a practiced hand. Their mornings had looked like this for nearly 40 years. But today was different. As Margaret opened the front door to retrieve the newspaper, she paused. There, sitting in the exact center of the welcome mat, was a single red leaf. It wasn't just any leaf. This one was large, uncurled, and pristine, as if it had been carefully chosen and gently placed. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Ha!" she muttered. She looked up and around. The branches above were still full, barely shedding their colors. There was no breeze, no other leaves scattered across the porch or steps. She bent down, picked it up, and gave it a twirl between her fingers before dropping it into the compost bin beside the door. "Must have fallen just right," she said to herself. She didn't notice the pair of eyes watching her from under the hydrangea bush. Later that morning, Margaret brought it up as they washed dishes. "There was a leaf on the mat this morning," she said, rinsing a plate. "Just one, sitting right in the center." Harold raised a brow but didn't look up. "It's autumn, Maggie. They tend to fall. It's what they do." "Still, it was odd," she said. "It looked like someone had placed it there." Harold chuckled. "We've got a poetic wind." She didn't press it further. That evening, as twilight stretched shadows across the yard, Margaret pulled the curtains aside and looked out toward the porch. That's when she saw the cat again. It had been lingering for a few weeks now. A scrappy little thing with a smoky coat and sharp green eyes. Never came close, never made a sound. It simply appeared some days, always sitting near the base of the steps, just watching. "There's our ghost," she said as Harold joined her with a mug of cocoa. "That cat again?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "Yes, he's not really a stray, I don't think. Looks clean. He won't let me near him, though." Harold took a sip. "Probably belongs to one of the newer neighbors. Or maybe he's just chosen our porch for the view." Margaret smiled faintly. "He reminds me of Dusty," she said. "Remember how Dusty used to sit out back and watch the wind like he was listening to it?" Harold nodded, quiet for a moment. Dusty had been their companion for 15 years, a rescue cat who filled their empty nester years with paw prints and purring. He'd passed away last winter, and though neither of them said much about it, the silence had grown noticeably heavier since. The next morning was cooler, the air sharp with the scent of dried leaves and chimney smoke. Margaret opened the front door, and there it was again. Another leaf. This one was golden, with little speckles of rust red on its edges. And like before, it was sitting perfectly centered on the doormat. Margaret stared at it for a long time before picking it up. "Second time," she said aloud, "and not a single other leaf on the porch." The wind was calm. The porch was swept clean. The trees, though touched with autumn, were still mostly intact. She glanced toward the hydrangea bush. Nothing. No movement, no glint of green eyes. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that someone, had left the leaf there. That day, she placed a small saucer of milk on the steps, just in case. The third leaf appeared on a Thursday. It was pale, almost silver, with delicate veins that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Margaret found it just after sunrise, her slippers brushing against the mat. She paused again, letting out a small breath through her nose. The leaves were beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like ritual. This time, she didn't toss it away. Instead, she brought it inside and placed it gently on the kitchen counter next to the teapot. Harold looked up from his chair, where he was still working through yesterday's crossword. "Another one?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Third day in a row." Harold scratched his chin, peering at the leaf over his glasses. That's not maple. Not local either. Margaret frowned. What do you mean? He stood slowly, bones creaking in familiar protest, and picked up the leaf. We used to have a tree like this outside our old house, remember? Back in Woodcrest when Daniel was little. He used to climb it all the time, drove you mad. She smiled faintly at the memory. You always had to pull him down before dinner. Harold nodded, gaze distant. I haven't seen a tree like this in years. Not in this neighborhood. That night, the cat came closer. Margaret had been leaving out food each evening. First milk, then a small bowl of tuna, and now proper kibble in a clean dish. At first, the cat had kept his distance, watching from the shadows with sharp, patient eyes. But now he stepped up to the edge of the porch. He didn't flinch when Margaret opened the door, though he stayed cautious, his tail low, his ears flicking at the smallest sound. Bram, she said softly. That's your name now. Harold, who had been standing behind her with a cup of tea, chuckled. Why Bram? He looks like a little gentleman, mysterious, like a poet. Harold sipped his tea and gave a half shrug. All right, Bram it is. Each morning after, the pattern continued. A single perfect leaf on the mat, each one different in color, shape, and species. Margaret began lining them up on the windowsill. She didn't say much about it at first, but Harold noticed her starting to check the porch with anticipation, like someone expecting a letter. By the sixth leaf, Harold grew curious enough to do some research. He sat at the dining room table with an old botanical field guide, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. Sycamore, he muttered. Tulip poplar, chestnut, birch, and this one. He held it up between his fingers. Ginkgo. You'd have to go 2 towns over to find one of those. Margaret glanced up from her tea. Are you saying someone's collecting them? I'm saying it doesn't add up. It's not windy enough to carry them from that far, and I haven't seen any kids around. She looked out the window where Bram was now curled up on the porch chair, tail wrapped neatly over his paws. You think it's the cat? Harold gave her a wry smile. I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if he's part of it. She turned back toward the window, watching Bram's chest rise and fall. He's a quiet one, she said, but he's got something behind those eyes. That evening, while Margaret prepared dinner, Harold stepped outside. Bram didn't run. He watched Harold with slow, steady blinks, head tilted. I know that tree, Harold said, crouching near the mat, holding the leaf from earlier between his fingers. Daniel used to bring these home, said they looked like stars. Bram blinked again. Harold sighed and sat on the step, knees cracking. We haven't talked about him in a while, he said softly. Sometimes it hurts too much. Other times it just fades, like old photographs. He wasn't expecting a response, and Bram didn't offer one. Only sat a few feet away, eyes half-lidded, tail twitching once. Inside, Margaret stirred a pot of soup and looked out the kitchen window again. She didn't know where the leaves were coming from. She didn't know why Bram had chosen their home. But she felt something shifting, like a breeze brushing through a room long closed. That night, before bed, she moved the leaves from the windowsill into a small box lined with soft cloth. She pressed them gently between layers of wax paper. Just in case, she murmured. Outside, Bram settled into his usual place on the porch chair, his ears twitching in the autumn air. By the end of the second week, Harold had started a notebook. It was one of those worn, spiral-bound pads with yellowing pages, the kind he used to carry during his working years for scribbling to-do lists and oil change reminders. But now, it held something different. Sketches of leaves, notes on their species and memories. Each morning, before even pouring his coffee, Harold would check the doormat. And each morning, without fail, there was a new leaf. He'd pick it up with care, study its curves and ridges, and place it on the kitchen table beneath the warm light of the window. Margaret had stopped questioning the oddity. She simply fetched Bram's bowl and filled it, humming softly as the cat trotted up the steps, tail high. By now, Bram lingered. He'd stretch out on the porch swing, watching the breeze pass through the trees. Some days he meowed once, low and pointed, like a greeting. Other days, he'd nudge the bowl closer with a paw, giving a short, satisfied trill before settling into a loaf beside the door. "He's getting bold," Margaret chuckled one morning as Bram tried to follow her inside. "Almost like he thinks he lives here." "Maybe he does," Harold murmured, not looking up from his notebook. He had just finished taping down a russet-colored leaf with 5 serrated points. Red oak. Same kind Daniel used to collect after those camping trips. Margaret paused in the doorway. "You remember that?" "Clear as day." He smiled faintly. "That trail out near Firefly Hollow. Daniel insisted we make leaf rubbings, even though the wind kept blowing the paper away." Margaret laughed softly, the sound warm and distant. "He'd chase those papers down like they were treasure." Harold nodded, gaze still distant. "This one," he said, pointing to an oblong leaf with pale edges, "is from a magnolia. He planted one with you in the backyard when he was 10. It only bloomed once, remember? Blamed the soil for being grumpy," Margaret said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Not the gardener." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was reflective, almost gentle. The kind of quiet that grows between people who have lived through loss, and yet still feel its echoes in the flutter of leaves and the stillness of autumn mornings. Outside, Bram stretched luxuriously and let out a soft, drawn-out meow. It was the kind of sound that didn't ask for food or attention, just acknowledgement. Margaret stepped back out with a biscuit in one hand and crouched beside him. "Is it you, Bram?" she whispered, smiling. "Are you the one bringing these? Because if so, you're doing a fine job." He pressed his forehead into her palm and purred. Harold, watching through the window, tapped his pen lightly against the notebook. "You know," he said, half to himself, "it's like he remembers with us." Margaret glanced up. "You think he knows who Daniel was?" "No," Harold said after a pause. "But I think maybe he knows something matters here." That evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, Harold walked around the yard with Bram trailing behind him like a shadow. He stopped near the edge of the property, where an old oak stump sat like a forgotten throne. "That's where we built the treehouse," he said aloud. Bram sat at his feet, tail flicking gently. Harold rested a hand on the stump. "He fell from that branch once, scared you half to death, broke his arm. Remember?" Bram let out a single chirp, sharp, brief. Harold chuckled. "Yeah, that one's etched in." Back inside, Margaret had begun arranging the leaves in a proper photo album. She'd lined each one with parchment, added captions in delicate script beside Harold's notes. October 3rd, sweet gum. Hike at Gooseberry Falls. October 6th, ginkgo. Daniel's 8th grade science project. October 9th, red maple. Treehouse memory. Each page became a tribute not just to the trees, but to the boy they once raised. Now a man living states away who hadn't come home in nearly a year. That night, Margaret placed the album gently on the coffee table and turned off the light. Outside, Bram was curled up on the porch chair, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling with slow contentment. A breeze stirred the trees. Somewhere, a single leaf loosened its grip and began to fall. Harold was up before the sun. The house was still wrapped in the soft hush of pre-dawn, and Margaret remained asleep, curled peacefully under the floral quilt. But Harold stood in the kitchen, mug in hand, staring at the leaf on the windowsill as if it had whispered something only he could hear. It was glossy and almost perfect, its shape delicate, 3 points and a smooth edge. Not red, not brown, but a strange shade of amber that glowed faintly in the rising light. He picked it up carefully, avoiding his usual notebook. This one was different. He carried it to the garage, flipping on the old desk lamp over his workbench. The bulb flickered once, then buzzed to life. Pulling out a thick tree identification guide, Harold flipped through page after page until he stopped. He found it. The golden tulip poplar, Liriodendron rubrum aureus. An ornamental cultivar, rare and highly localized. His eyebrows knit together. That tree hadn't grown anywhere near here. In fact, it didn't grow at all anymore. Not since the one in their backyard had been cut down. He remembered it clearly. Daniel had picked it from a nursery catalog as a birthday gift for Margaret when he was just 6. "It looks like sunshine," he'd said with wide, proud eyes. It had grown tall and thin, blossoms glowing like lanterns in the spring. But it hadn't survived the soil. After just a few years, they'd had to cut it down. Harold had chopped it himself, cursing the roots for giving up too soon. And now, one of its leaves had found its way back to the porch. Harold slowly sat down. His heart wasn't racing, but it wasn't calm either. There was something under the surface, a thrum of unease. At sunrise, Bram appeared as always, casually stepping onto the porch like it was his kingdom. His tail flicked once, then twice, as he dropped another leaf beside the welcome mat, this one broad, dark green, waxy. Harold opened the door before Margaret could. "You again," Harold muttered, eyes narrowing. "Where are you finding these?" Bram blinked slowly and gave a low, rolling chirp. Harold crouched down and picked up the new leaf. This one was no easier to explain. A camphor tree, if he had to guess. But those were subtropical, nothing you'd find in this part of the country. By the time Margaret joined him with her robe tied loosely at the waist, Harold was already deep into the internet, surrounded by leaf samples. She leaned over his shoulder. "Researching Bram's mysterious forest?" "I'm telling you," he said, not looking away. "These trees, they don't grow here anymore. Some never did." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You think he's planting them overnight?" Harold didn't laugh. He looked up slowly. "I think he's bringing them from places that no longer exist." There was silence between them. The absurdity of the sentence hung in the air, but Margaret didn't scoff. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at Bram, now dozing lazily in the sun patch on the porch. "You think he's just a cat, but you're the one with a notebook and a growing suspicion," she said gently. "I don't think he's just a cat," Harold replied. "I think he's something older." Margaret tilted her head, curious. "Older?" Harold hesitated, as if testing the thought in his mouth. "Something tied to memory, to place, maybe even to people. Look, this." He held up the golden leaf again. "This doesn't make sense. That tree's been gone for decades, and somehow a fresh leaf shows up here now." Margaret didn't reply right away. Then she said quietly, "Maybe he's returning what's been lost." Harold looked at her, startled by how much that thought unsettled him and moved him. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Harold stayed out on the porch. Bram sat beside him, tail tucked neatly around his feet, gazing out into the trees like a watchman. Harold finally asked, voice low, "What are you?" Bram didn't respond, not with a meow or a twitch, just that slow, calm blinking, the kind that cats give when they trust you. Harold sighed and leaned back in his chair. He remembered a story his grandfather once told him. Something about guardians of place, creatures that lingered between the physical and the memory, returning only when called by love or grief. He hadn't thought about it in years. But something about the way Bram arrived, the timing of the leaves, the types of trees. Harold looked down at the sleeping cat, his breathing steady and soft. Maybe he wasn't a messenger. Maybe he was a memory made flesh. Or a guide. Or maybe, just maybe, he was something even older than that. A soul who had wandered through time, picking up what others left behind. And now he was here, one leaf at a time, helping Harold remember. It had been raining since dawn. A steady, silver rain that blurred the edges of the world outside, softened the trees, and filled the gutters with sound. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the water bead and race down the glass. She didn't expect to see Bram in this weather. But there he was. At first, just a blur of movement. Then his familiar shape, drenched and small, appeared at the edge of the porch. He hesitated for a heartbeat before stepping up and pawing once, twice, gently at the door. Margaret blinked. "Harold," she called softly. "He's here." Harold shuffled in, adjusting his glasses. "In this mess?" She nodded. He's scratching, like he wants to come in. They both stood there for a second too long, surprised, maybe, or unsure of the invisible line they were about to cross. But then Margaret opened the door. Rain curled around the edges of the frame, and Bram stood blinking up at them, soaked to the bone, looking vulnerable. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered. Bram stepped in without hesitation. Margaret grabbed a towel and crouched beside him. The old tabby didn't protest as she gently wrapped him and began patting him dry, careful and warm. Water matted his fur, making him look thinner, older. That's when she saw it. A faint, pale indentation around his neck. Not a wound, just a shallow groove, like something had once rested there for a long, long time. "Harold?" she murmured. "Come look at this." Harold knelt slowly beside her. Bram sat calmly between them, content now, purring faintly. Harold leaned closer. "It's from a collar." Margaret nodded, brushing the spot lightly. "But not recent. It's long gone." Harold didn't speak. He stood slowly, then walked out of the room without a word. Margaret stayed with Bram, her fingers running gently through his damp fur, the old ache in her chest blooming again, the one that came with memories she didn't try to summon but came anyway. 10 minutes later, Harold returned with a box. Dusty, dented at the corners, filled with photos, hundreds of them, stretching back decades. He laid them out on the coffee table and began flipping through with careful, practiced fingers. Bram jumped up onto the armrest, curious, his tail curling beside Harold's shoulder. Margaret came to sit beside them, towel in hand, and then Harold stopped. It was a picture taken on a bright summer morning. Their son, Daniel, maybe 8 years old, smiling at the camera with missing front teeth and muddy knees. In his arms, a tiny tabby kitten, wide-eyed, striped tail flicking toward the lens. Around the kitten's neck, a small red collar, faded but clear in the photograph. A tiny bell hung at its center. Harold stared. "It's him." Margaret leaned closer. "But it can't be." "Look," he said, voice quiet. "That mark, that's where it was." She took the photo from his hand, heart pounding. Her eyes moved between the photo and Bram, now perched calmly on the couch, licking his paw like none of this concerned him. "It's been over 30 years, she whispered. They sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old wall clock and the rain hitting the roof. Margaret held the photo tightly. "I remember that day. Daniel found him behind the shed. Said he was a gift from the trees." Harold's eyes didn't leave Bram. "He named him Bramble." Margaret looked up sharply. "That's right. Bram was short for Bramble." Neither of them said it, but it hung between them like mist in the air. The cat they'd named unknowingly, again, after a kitten they'd loved and lost long ago. Bram, or Bramble, turned his head and gave a slow blink, that same quiet understanding in his gaze. "It's not possible," Harold said softly. "Cats don't live that long." Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "Then maybe he isn't just a cat." That night, after Bram dried and napped and ate, they let him sleep by the fire. He curled in the same spot Daniel's kitten had once claimed, the old rug by the hearth. Margaret and Harold didn't talk much after that. There wasn't a need. Some things, once felt deeply enough, don't require explanation. They just are. And as the fire cracked and the rain tapered off into gentle tapping, the photo of Daniel and Bramble remained on the table, as if time itself had folded quietly back on itself and offered them one more chance to remember. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the world washed and still. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind that made everything seem sharper, more present. Harold stood in the backyard, a steaming mug in hand, staring at the row of trees beyond the fence. Bram sat nearby on the porch, tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes fixed on Harold as if waiting for something unspoken to be said. Inside, Margaret was at the kitchen table, the box of leaves laid out like puzzle pieces across the surface. She'd carefully pressed each one between pages of old books. Now, arranged side by side, they formed a mosaic of quiet colors and shapes. Maple, oak, ginkgo, sweetgum, sycamore. Some were brown and curling at the edges. Others had retained their crisp autumn brilliance. Harold came in and joined her. Neither spoke for a moment. Then he pointed to one of the leaves, large, fan-shaped, golden. That one grew near Miller's Hill. We used to hike there every fall. Margaret nodded, her finger drifting to a jagged-edged leaf. This is from that park where we planted bulbs. The one Daniel said smelled like cinnamon after the rain. Harold gave a small smile. He was always so specific with things like that. They fell silent again, letting the leaves speak instead. It's not random, Margaret said finally. None of it is. Harold nodded. Each leaf is a place, a memory. They stared down at them, at a life mapped out in fallen pieces of the past. He's been bringing us memories, she whispered. Harold leaned back, eyes misting. Bram is Bramble. He has to be. It's not just the collar mark, or the photo. It's how he acts, the way he watches us. Waits, that strange intelligence in his eyes. Margaret looked toward the living room, where Bram now lay curled near the fireplace, as if he belonged there all along. Then where was he all these years? Harold shook his head. Lost, or waiting, or maybe something else entirely. That afternoon, Bram disappeared for several hours. Neither of them worried. Not anymore. They sat together on the porch, letting the memory of their son breathe in the stillness. As the sun began to dip, a soft rustle near the steps pulled their attention. Bram had returned, and in his mouth, held with careful pride, was another leaf. He placed it on the doormat. Margaret reached down and picked it up, holding it between her fingers. Her breath caught. Harold leaned in. Is that? She nodded slowly. It's from the dogwood tree. The dogwood. The one Daniel had planted with Harold the summer before the accident. They'd picked it out together at the nursery, Daniel insisting on that specific sapling because of its pink blossoms. Harold had dug the hole while Daniel steadied the little tree with his small, eager hands. That summer, it had bloomed. The next year, it died. Too much shade, the landscaper had said. But Harold never replaced it. He hadn't had the heart. This leaf, Margaret whispered, voice trembling, isn't just a memory. It's the last one. The most important one. Harold took it gently from her. It was still slightly damp from Bram's mouth, delicate and pale. He saved it for now, he said, to tell us. This is where it ends. They sat with that truth for a long time. It wrapped around them like the fading light. Heavy, tender, inevitable. Margaret reached for Harold's hand. Do you think Daniel sent him back? Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Bram, who was now gazing out toward the trees again, calm and still. I think, Harold said quietly, that love leaves marks, on places, on animals, on us. Maybe Bram was always meant to find his way back. And maybe Daniel knew we'd need that. Margaret closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. That night, they framed the photo of Daniel with the kitten and placed it on the mantel. Beneath it, they arranged the leaves in a shallow bowl, not as decoration, but as a monument, a quiet tribute. Bram slept by the fireplace, peaceful, his breathing steady. And when the house was dark, and the wind rustled gently outside, Margaret whispered to the shadows, "Thank you for coming home." The morning light filtered in gently through the curtains, casting soft stripes across the floor. Margaret rose like she always did, the quiet hum of the kettle warming the kitchen air, her slippers brushing the familiar path to the front door. She opened it and looked down. No leaf. For the first time in months, the doormat was bare. No flutter of color, no strange shape from a distant memory, just quiet. Her heart stilled. She stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, eyes scanning the garden, the porch, the yard beyond. "Bram?" she called gently. There was no meow, no sound of pause. Then she saw him, at the far end of the yard near the tree, that tree, the one their son had planted with Harold. Bram lay curled beneath its base. His fur, once sleek and striped, was now still. His body formed a soft crescent nestled in the fallen leaves as though the tree itself had called him home. Margaret walked toward him slowly, almost unwilling to believe what she already knew. Harold appeared at her side, having noticed her absence from the kitchen. When he saw Bram, he didn't speak. He only rested a hand on her shoulder and exhaled, the sound caught between grief and understanding. Together, they knelt beside the cat. He looked peaceful, as if asleep in the warm lap of memory. His eyes were closed, face relaxed. He had chosen this place, that tree, for his final rest, as if he knew what it meant, as if he knew it mattered. "He brought us home again," Margaret whispered, tears brimming but not falling. "He gave us Daniel, gave us something we didn't even know we needed." Harold nodded. "And now he's home too." They buried Bram under the tree that afternoon. The soil was soft from the recent rain, and the tree's roots had curled out like gentle arms. Margaret laid him in a small wooden box, lining it with an old dish towel he'd once claimed as his own. Harold added a single leaf, the dogwood, the final offering. They didn't speak much during the burial. There was no need. The wind spoke for them, rustling through the branches overhead, scattering a few leaves that drifted like memories down around them. In the days that followed, the absence of leaves on the doormat felt like a silence too loud to ignore. But oddly, it didn't feel empty. Instead, the leaves that had been delivered, now carefully pressed, labeled, and arranged in a leather-bound album, filled their home with something else. Comfort, story, connection. Margaret often found herself flipping through the album after breakfast, tracing the edges of each leaf with her fingertip. "This one's from the orchard Daniel used to sneak apples from," she'd murmur. "And this," Harold would add, pointing to a long, narrow leaf, "was the tree outside his first-grade classroom." Their son's life, captured not in photos or letters, but in pieces of nature, wild, weathered, and carried back to them by a friend long thought lost. Sometimes Margaret would sit by the tree in the afternoons, cup of tea in hand, watching the sunlight filter through its branches. And sometimes, when the wind stirred just right, she imagined she could hear the soft patting of paws across the grass. Harold took to visiting the tree at dusk. He'd stand for a few minutes in quiet reflection, then return to the house with soil still clinging to his shoes and peace etched gently across his face. They never got another leaf, but they didn't need to, because Bram had brought them full circle, not just through memory, but through presence, through love that endured beyond logic or distance or even time. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret tied a small bell to the lowest branch of the tree. It chimed softly in the wind, a quiet hello, a thank you, a reminder. They would never know how Bram had returned. They didn't question it anymore. Some things they realized weren't meant to be solved, only felt. And so the tree grew older. Its leaves fell and returned each year. And beneath it, love remained, buried deep, but never gone.